Anyone got a question?
Yes.
For anybody?
I'll ask one. This is more for Dr. Versluis.
Yeah.
So should I stand? I don't know. So I'm from New York, and I've always had a problem sort of conceptualizing outsiders' ideas and concepts of the loss that New York sustained on 9/11. And you talked a little bit about the different locations, like you said West Coast authors confront 9/11. So what sort of themes or differences did you see from the West Coast authors as compared to New York? Was it more like a national loss as opposed to a personal loss, or were there any other things that might maybe help me conceptualize what other people did in order to cope with 9/11?
Yeah, well, in those collections that I mentioned, there's a great diversity of responses, and they were immediate responses to the event. And most of these stories are autobiographical. It's what people were doing at the time and how they tried to cope with what happened. And I remember one story, for instance, of a person who was taking a trip to the Grand Canyon, the river, rafting down the Grand Canyon. And it was 3 or 4 days after the event before he became aware that something had happened. And then the group dynamics that were involved, because you're out in the wilderness, completely isolated, and by coincidence, because they meet another group traveling in the other direction, they become aware that the world has changed, beyond recognition. And the way that this small group of isolated people cope with this, especially since one of them lives in New York, and of course is very worried about the circumstances that go on. I mean, that's one thing I remember. And so everybody, has a localized reaction to 9/11. To say that there is a difference between the two, I must say New Yorkers, and you find evidence of that in Art Spiegelman's In the Shadow of No Towers. New Yorkers were rather almost protective of their ownership of the event. They feel that only they have the street credentials to talk about it. And personally, I came across this when, I for the longest time, I went to Columbia in the summer to teach a course on New York fiction, which of course makes perfect sense for a Belgian to travel 3,000 miles as a crow flies to talk in New York about New York to New Yorkers. Nobody ever batted an eyelash. The kids took it in stride, and of course, so you have studied the material, you can come and tell us. Until I decided to teach a 9/11 course, and then all of a sudden my credentials were questioned. Was I entitled, not my scholarly credentials, but sort of, did I have a moral right to talk about this as an outsider? And I had to fight every inch of the way. So there is a certain feeling in New York, I think, that this is their event, and it has got to do with the fact that it was exploited by the Bush administration. It was taken away from them. It was turned into ways that most New Yorkers did not agree with, and indeed their grief was not perceived as a cry for war. And that feeling of being expropriated, I felt, was very, very much present. And that's where I see a difference between, the insider view and the outsider's view.
Thank you very much.
I also have a question for our second speaker. In the book, Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, Foer does a lot of things that are perhaps unconventional in the original novel, like overlapping text on top of itself, use of colors and pictures, and that flip book at the end of it. I'm curious what you have to think, whether that was an effective means of communication in a time period where authors are struggling to communicate using just a regular page-to-page novel, or if you think, what are your thoughts on the use of those?
Well, those graphic devices are certainly meant to indicate the difficulty of talking about trauma. It's not just the trauma of 9/11, it's also the trauma of the Dresden bombings, which incidentally were inflicted by American Air Force and Germans, which, talking about triangulation, that's of course a technique of triangulating the thing, robbing the event 9/11 of its uniqueness, pointing out there had been outrages before. in some of which America was the aggrieved party, but sometimes it was also the aggressor, right? And in trying to talk about that, the characters, I mean, one character has a completely lost his voice, right? Is struck by aphasia as a symptom of trauma. He cannot talk anymore. He has lost his ability to talk, to communicate, because there is no way you can talk about it. And it's that character in particular who, for instance, starts scribbling, because the only way he can communicate is by writing. He can start scribbling so frantically that he runs out of space. So, you know, the space in between the lines becomes smaller and smaller until it begins to overlap. But he keeps scribbling, and the page gets darker and darker. So those are graphic devices to talk about unsayability and the problem of overcoming them. I think they're rather functional. They're not gimmicks. I think they do the job, and it adds an additional layer to this multi-layered book.
I'm just throwing out a potential hypothesis here. But can we talk about 9/11 as a spectacular event that changes the relationships between these two forms of expression, of articulation, the textual and
visual? It's funny because I feel like, I deal with the visual arts, but I kind of deal with a special part of the visual arts, I'd say, which is the political part of that. And to think through that in a kind of really interesting way, too, because simultaneous with 9/11, there was the alt-globalization movement happening in Seattle, we know, in '99 that was happening. But right after 9/11, there was, these things have been traveling around the world. It happened in Prague, Montreal, Genoa, Sao Paulo, and not long after there was meant to be another protest in the United States in Miami for the free trade agreement gathering. And I'm thinking about the textual in relation to protest. And actually I showed that sign of our brief when I signed a cry for war. There became the kind of language that was being used in the protest movement suddenly had to confront this new language of the war on terror. And there was a way in which, because afterwards the protesters were basically positioned as the terrorists or the unpatriotic. And all their signs that had been working for so long, suddenly the language of it no longer worked. It didn't resonate publicly, globally. And it's interesting only because that was a moment, I think, in the activist art culture, or just activist culture, where there became a distrust not only of the visual, but of the textual, I will say, in a very radical way. Not only because people, almost to go to what you both were talking about, this kind of taking a step back and be like, this doesn't work. It wasn't only that like words should not be said because we must think, but also because these skill sets no longer work for us, because they are being used against us. And so this withdrawal, I think, from the visual and the textual, it feels like a mutual withdrawal out of fear, but also reconsideration. At the same time, what's amazing, this kind of mediation, which is a fascinating thing, this is what I kind of wanted to ask you guys about, was this withdrawal of the artists, or I don't even say artists, the thinking people that are trying to deal with this trauma. That space produced such an opportunity to fill with words, because there was no lack of words that came out. it was rife with words, and it was rife with visuality, and all, the space of retreat was simultaneously engulfed with a barrage of all the skill sets that artists have. And I wonder, this is just something I was thinking about, I was like, what are the tactical missteps of withdrawing during that time? Because, in retrospect, you think, we should have been right out there confronting this thing, but everybody was traumatized and pulling back. So
I think also what happened there, that right after, and I speak as somebody who was a New Yorker, born and raised, that it had an atmosphere in which if you were opposing any actions that were taking place as far as the authorities were concerned, you were considered an unpatriotic suspect, immediately subject to arrest, as you were talking about, harassment, and that people were completely over the top. And now I live in Nebraska, and just forget about it. After 9/11, I remember I was trying to travel overseas, and at the airport they were actually literally going through my luggage with bayonets. I mean, they were literally lifting things out with bayonets as if something was going to explode. So I think that everybody was forced to step back because it was a very strong message. Mess with us, and we will really, take you out. And so that therefore, what rushed in to fill this vacuum were a group of sentimentalized and sort of publicly sanctioned pronouncements, by artists and by writers who basically responded in a very knee-jerk sort of, simplistic sort of fashion. And at the same time, like the work that you do, for example, doesn't really have the same kind of national scale, unfortunately, that somebody like Steven Spielberg does, and that basically his films can therefore, play forever in theaters no matter what their merits are or aren't. I mean, right now, for example, Jim Cameron is spending $100,000 a minute to turn Titanic, which was a terrible movie in the first place, into a 3D terrible movie. And George Lucas has spent $100,000 a minute to turn every one of the Star Wars movies into 3D movies. I mean, and this is the triumph of spectacle over content, over thought. I mean, I really think that this is the most profound change. But when I will say on the upside, that when I teach, as I'm teaching right now, a class in films that are more thoughtful, that most people who are the general public don't even know they're out there, but when they find that they're out there, they embrace them, they say, wow, this is a film that actually wants me to think, this is a film that's got some, some content and some juice, and I'm not even talking necessarily politically, but just something going on, other than leading you through every single step, which is what most movies do. And so that there's a hunger for that, but I think that it's clear that the ruling regime of images does not really want anything that is not totally safe, hence the rise of incredible, formulaic genre films, which also travel well globally. We haven't even talked about the fact that these films, go across the globe, and Hollywood is top 10 around the world. So what is our most important cultural artifact, export? Our films. But our worst films, as Glenn Close has made clear, things like, Spider-Man 3, which I once said to one of my students, have you seen it? Aren't you excited? I said, well, why? Because it's sort of like, here's Spider-Man, here's the villain, here's the battle, and the good man wins. The end, that's it. I don't need to see it. So it's sort of like, there's nothing going on but the rent. But yet, there are great films like Melancholia, which I urge you to see if you have not, Margin Call, which is a brilliant film, and my favorite filmmaker, Manuel de Oliveira, who's 103 years old, lives in Portugal, and has been cranking out films at a furious pace. At his 90s. His most recent film is called The Strange Case of Angelica, gorgeous film. And when I screen these films for my students who have never seen a film which has got some really thoughtful content in it, or even a black and white film, right? They're literally, they fall out of their chairs. I mean, just to wrap it up, just my part, 3 weeks ago I ran an Ozu film called There Was a Father from 1942, which is the only film that Yasujiro Ozu made during World War II. And it's a tough film to introduce people to, because it's all static shots, they're all from a Tatami viewpoint, there's just pillow shots in between, it's all straight cuts. And so several people in the audience kept staring at each other like, huh? And then they look back at the screen, and after a while they look at each other, huh? Like that, and I thought to myself, okay, what's going on here, right? So then the film ends, and they all come down the stairs, we're all talking and stuff, and they're still doing the same thing, right? So finally I turn and say, okay, you hated it, right? He said, no, I can't believe anybody would make a film like that. I've never seen a film like that. I loved it, you know, and I'm just, yeah, okay, great. You know, so it's, I think people are hungry for content. I guess one thing I would add is this. One of the downsides of digitization is the fact that the important works get marginalized. When everything had to open into a theater, right, everything competed on an equal plane, right? Beach Blanket Bingo and La Dolce Vita, right? You had to go to a theater to see it, right? But now the stuff that's more thoughtful goes straight to DVD because advertisement departments say it's more important for us to put our multi-millions behind, say, Warhorse, right, than to a film that is more problematic. And so that's one of the bad sides of digitization is that unless you live in a major metropolis, you won't see these films and you won't even know they exist. That's the key thing, because there's no advertising campaign or anything, but you won't even know they exist unless you are really into it, you know, as I am into film, and I know that they're coming and I look for them, you know, and so that's really a problem.
I want to first of all thank all of you for your talks tonight. It's really great. One thought that's rattling around my head is that one of the things that kind of is common to everything that we're talking about here is the disintegration of our access to genuine affect, to genuine emotion. We talk about sentimentality as kind of flattened out, cheap, predictable, simplified.
Emotional pornography. Emotional pornography. Thomas Kincaid. You know what I mean? That kind of stuff.
So that it's predictable, it's non-complex, and it satisfies in a way that candy satisfies with empty calories. You talked about kind of the way in which fear and other types of emotions are kind of portrayed, staged, but also then kind of expropriated from us and used against us. And you also talked about in several novelistic representations, the one that you mentioned that caught my eye was Don DeLillo's Falling Man, which the entire narrative takes place in an affectless space in order to kind of depict the problem of how does one return to being human, if one does. And by the end of the novel, it's not clear that one really does. It's just the humanity gets bigger and bigger, but the affect never returns the access to emotion. So my question is, you know, it's not about being a hipster. It's not about being kind of cool and ironizing this. This isn't really ironizable. But how do we reassert our access to genuine emotion? I mean, I wonder. You suggest some places of resistance at the end of your talk. I'm wondering what are other places where we see, and you also talk about complexity as perhaps another solution. The novel itself is complexity. I wonder what are other sites resisting it. You suggest, I know it sounds like a mistake on a question, it's a question, but you suggest that the sheer force of capital is too great, that silencing these critics is a way of protecting, you know, multinational investments. So I wonder where do we have access to genuine emotion in the public sphere?
We have to seek it out. I think that's really, I mean, when you were talking about Don DeLillo, for example, the horrifying thought flew into my mind that more people read Danielle Steele than Don DeLillo or know about her, right? But you have to seek it out because it's not being publicly offered, I don't think, because I think that you know, it's the era of Dancing with the Stars, et cetera, you know. I think that actually one of that you have to be, and that's what I try to teach my students, an informed consumer of images or of words or of art, and to seek out the stuff that is going to engage you and challenge you. And one of my goals is to send people out not content anymore to go to the mall, right? And in fact, I hear that all the time, that suddenly in another class or another thing, they will see a film or something and say, totally empty, you know, but you have to go looking for it because it's not going to come looking for you. I mean, that's the problem. I mean, it doesn't have the capital investment behind it, and it also doesn't uphold the values that dominant society wants us to just fall in line, you know, and the stuff that you're talking about questions that, and et cetera.
I think the economics involved in writing a book is of course different from artworks and certainly movies. That's to say, it doesn't take any investment. All you have to do is invest your time. You need a computer and not much more, and then the rest is your imagination and your thought. So there is still, I guess, something that can stay out of the realm of the commercial a little bit more. Of course, the book has to be printed and published, and then it has to be promoted, and all these things come in again. But I still think that the word itself is heuristic, whereas, as to say, you know, it's a matter of exploiting and exploring the truth or authenticity to the extent that it exists. At the same time, of course, the word can be abused and is abused all the time. But I still think there is you know, potentially a source of resistance. But of course, it takes also an audience. But that's why we're teachers for, right? And I do feel a great eagerness in my students to get away from the superficiality of mass culture and to deal with something that is a little more profound and that speaks more to their real concern. So I'm not so pessimistic as some of the other people at the table here.
Would you have the last word?
Oh, yes.
As we run out of time.
Sure.
So we'll use the audience, but also welcome you to approach the speakers, you know, personally.
Feel free to approach
So,
us.
Well, you know,
yeah,
sorry. Okay. Well, I kind of have this weird post-structuralist approach only because I have no nostalgia for the past or the future in a sense. I think that I don't believe there's anything like natural about emotion. I think they're all produced, and the conditions we live in today, I think, are the results of, you know, I think that looking at what the forces are, that these techniques of the manipulation of emotion under capital are just very effective and grow. They grow. I don't want to blame anybody. I don't think I think it's okay, but it's producing situations we're in. I think one thing, to go to the de Tocqueville kind of motto, which is very enjoyable, I think the entire system that we live in is built on false premises of the Enlightenment. We believe that we are thinking people that make decisions based on ideas. This is clearly untrue. And I think that the rational project is totally out of whack. I think it's a mistake to build things based on how things ought to be. Because that's clearly not how we are. We clearly are emotional creatures. We are desirous, irrational. We are full of animosity and hunger and love.
We are products of the evolution. We are part animals.
We're part animals. And I think the sooner we come up with systems that acknowledge that and also acknowledge the very huge power that happens from not putting in check the systems that make people things. The culture machines make people things. Just letting that run rampant produces the world we're in. So I think that a real kind of deep thinking needs to happen on the kind of systems that are allowing this stuff to go unchecked, which butts up against complicated things. You know, freedom of press, freedom that we typically think. You know, I don't think it's an accident that certain kind of fundamentalism is to some degree on the rise, because at least it's acknowledging the dangers of unfettered culture industries manipulating people into very problematic sadomasochistic relationships with the civic. So that's the last one.